I caught my wife cheating with my son's best friend. Karma took care of the rest for 23 years. I believed I was living a fairy tale life with my wife. At 57, I cherished what felt like a perfect marriage. My wife, 55, was my partner, my best friend, and someone I admired deeply. She's beautiful, intelligent, and outgoing, the kind of person who lights up a room with her presence. While our personalities differ, she's extroverted and empathetic. While I'm more introverted and rational, we always complemented each other well. Together, we built a life centered around love, family, and shared passions. We traveled extensively, explored breathtaking destinations, and raised three amazing children. Our youngest, a boy, is 15 and something of a miracle. We weren't planning to have another child after our two daughters, now 20 and 18, but his arrival was a blessing. Life was full of joy and adventure until it wasn't. I had no idea that the foundation of my marriage was crumbling beneath me until a seemingly innocent family vacation turned into a nightmare that changed everything. Jason, my son's best friend, Jason, entered our lives when they were just 14 years old. Jason was a remarkable young man, polite, intelligent, and mature beyond his years. He came from a hardworking family, and despite their modest means, his parents sacrificed a lot to give him opportunities. He and my son were inseparable, spending hours playing basketball, video games, and attending after-school programs together. Jason became a fixture in our home, and my wife grew fond of him, often giving him rides or buying him small gifts. Looking back, I realize now how much I underestimated the closeness of their bond. The first signs of trouble 3 months ago, as we were preparing for a family vacation, I noticed something odd. My wife was on the phone in the kitchen, her tone unusually enthusiastic. She sounded like she was trying to persuade someone to join us on our trip, mentioning how much fun it would be. When I walked in, she jumped, clutching her chest as if I had startled her. It was an overreaction, to say the least. A few minutes later, she casually mentioned that Jason wanted to join us on the trip. My son, overhearing this, clarified that he hadn't even told Jason about the vacation yet. That struck me as strange. How could Jason know about our plans? And why did my wife seem so invested in convincing him to come along? At the time, I dismissed my suspicions. My wife had always been compassionate and socially active, often mentoring young people or volunteering for progressive causes. I assumed her fondness for Jason was part of her nurturing nature. Odd behavior leading up to the trip. In the days before our trip, my wife's behavior grew more peculiar. She went on a shopping spree with our 18-year-old daughter, returning with gifts not just for our family, but also for Jason. It wasn't the first time she'd bought something for him, so I didn't think much of it. However, during a family dinner, I noticed how often her eyes wandered toward Jason. She seemed unusually happy, even giddy, whenever he was around. That night, she stayed up late with the kids, something she hadn't done in years. She didn't come to bed until well past 3 a.m. Again, I brushed it off, thinking she was just enjoying family time. The vacation in paradise, we flew to Barbados, staying at a luxurious resort in Carlisle Bay. The white sand beaches and turquoise waters were breathtaking, a perfect escape from the routine of daily life. While I spent my days relaxing on the beach, reading investment articles, my wife and the kids went scuba diving and exploring. One evening, my wife, our son, his girlfriend, and Jason went to a disco bar. I stayed behind with our eldest daughter for dinner. When my son and the others returned later that night, my wife and Jason were conspicuously absent. My son mentioned that they had gone on a local wildlife tour together. It felt like a punch to the gut. Why would my wife choose to spend time alone with Jason instead of enjoying the vacation with her family? The moment of truth, the following night. I woke up around 1 a.m. and realized my wife wasn't in bed. I decided to step into the living room to enjoy the ocean breeze and wait for her return. As I opened the door, I saw movement near the couch. The TV was on, and there they were, my wife and Jason, sitting awkwardly on separate couches. She was wearing a revealing wrap that left little to the imagination. Beneath it, I recognized the bikini I'd found in her luggage, the one I thought she had bought as a surprise for me. The air in the room was heavy, the kind of tension you can feel in your bones. They both avoided eye contact, pretending to watch the TV. In that moment, my worst fears were confirmed. Confrontation and confession. When we returned home, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I confronted my wife, and after hours of denial, she finally broke down and admitted to an affair with Jason. Her excuses were hollow. She claimed it was a lapse in judgment, that she felt neglected because of my hearing loss, and that Jason had made her feel young again. I was shattered. The woman I had devoted my life to had betrayed not only me, but also our family. The fallout was swift and brutal. Jason's parents were horrified when they learned the truth. They cut ties with my wife and banned Jason from their home. His reputation took a massive hit, and he eventually dropped out of college after losing his scholarship. As for my wife, her life changed overnight. Friends and family who once admired her turned their backs. She begged for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to reconcile. The trust was gone, and with it, the foundation of our marriage. Karma, and moving forward in the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. My children were my anchor, providing love and support when I needed it most. I also sought therapy to process the betrayal and find a way to move forward. Karma dealt its hands swiftly. Jason's life spiraled out of control, and my wife, once the vibrant center of our family, faced the harsh consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, I found solace in the small joys of life, spending time with my kids, rediscovering hobbies, and cherishing the relationships that truly mattered. Looking back, I've learned a painful but valuable lesson. Trust is fragile, and even the strongest relationships can crumble under the weight of betrayal. While I may never fully heal from this experience, I've found strength in knowing that I did nothing to deserve it. I was faithful, loving, and committed. Her choices were hers alone, and she now lives with the consequences. As for me, I've chosen to move forward, wiser and stronger than before. As I stepped into the room that night, an unmistakable scent hit me, a scent I couldn't place anywhere else but in moments of intimacy. It was faint yet undeniable, and it made my stomach churn. My hearing might be deteriorating, but my other senses seemed heightened at that moment, as if compensating for my loss. A part of me wished I hadn't opened the door at all, while another part regretted not opening it more slowly. Perhaps then, I would have caught them in the act. Instead, I stood frozen at the threshold, my eyes darting between the two people in front of me, my wife and Jason. The air felt heavy with awkwardness, and their unease was palpable. Jason stood shirtless, clad only in a pair of shorts. His attire wasn't unusual, given the beachside location of our suite, but the way he seemed to shrink into the hardwood floors, avoiding my gaze, painted a very different picture. My wife, on the other hand, acted unnervingly casual, as if nothing was wrong, as if I hadn't just walked into an almost compromising scene. She followed me into the bedroom, her tone light, pretending everything was perfectly normal. She talked about mundane things, the kids, the plans for the next day, but I wasn't listening. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of doubt that had been building over the past few days. I couldn't bring myself to confront her at that moment. Words failed me, and instead, an overwhelming sense of humiliation and loneliness settled over me like a thick fog. That night was restless. Sleep evaded me as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My wife was beside me, her breathing steady, as though the weight of what had just transpired hadn't touched her at all. Meanwhile, I was drowning in an ocean of self-pity and suspicion. I replayed every moment in my head, the phone call where I overheard her persuading Jason to join us on this vacation, the subtle yet noticeable shifts in her behavior, and now this. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong. By morning, I knew I had to address it. The uncertainty was eating me alive, and I needed answers. I pulled her aside, away from the kids, and voiced my suspicions. My voice was steady, but inside, I was trembling. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my eyes searching hers for even a flicker of guilt. Her reaction was swift and sharp, completely unlike the woman I thought I knew. She denied everything vehemently, her voice rising with indignation. "How could you even think that?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know how insulting this is?" The accusations flew back at me, hitting harder than I'd anticipated. She mocked my hearing loss, calling me paranoid and delusional. "You're not just losing your hearing, you're losing your mind," she spat. Her words stung, cutting deeper than any suspicion I harbored. The confrontation spiraled into chaos, her voice growing louder and sharper, and I found myself retreating. Her anger was so convincing, so resolute, that I began to doubt myself. Without solid proof, I had nothing to hold on to, and she made sure to remind me of that. By the end of it, I was the one apologizing, feeling ashamed for even bringing it up. But the damage was done. The rest of our vacation was strained, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. My wife treated me with disdain, her respect for me seemingly evaporating overnight. She was distant, almost cold, while Jason remained a shadow in the background, his presence an ever-looming reminder of my suspicions. Despite her efforts to maintain the facade of a happy family in front of the kids, I could see the cracks. She was overly cheerful, overly attentive to them, as if trying to overcompensate. But deep down, I knew. My gut didn't lie. 2 days before our vacation ended, an idea struck me, a desperate, almost obsessive plan. Back at home, I'd installed cameras around the house. They covered the common areas, the living room, game room, and hallways, and stored footage for up to 30 days. If there was proof of anything, it might be there. When we returned home, I seized the opportunity. Feigning illness, I sent my wife to pick up a prescription. It gave me just enough time to download the footage onto a portable hard drive. My heart raced as I worked, hoping and dreading that I might find something incriminating. That night, as everyone slept, I sat alone in the dark, laptop open, scrolling through hours of footage. My hands trembled as I fast-forwarded through days of mundane moments, the monotonous hum of the playback filling the room. Just as exhaustion threatened to take over, I saw it. The timestamp read 5:53 a.m. There she was, my wife, walking down the hallway near the game room. Jason appeared, meeting her halfway. My breath caught as I hit play. Their interaction was brief but damning. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was unmistakably passionate. As she turned to leave, he playfully slapped her behind, and she giggled, disappearing from the frame. My chest tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was all there, the proof I needed. My suspicions were no longer baseless paranoia, they were reality. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the footage, each repetition driving the knife deeper into my chest. the betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated deception involving someone we both knew, a man I had welcomed into my home, trusted around my children. The next morning, I couldn't look at her the same way. She moved around the house with ease, smiling, laughing with the kids, acting as though nothing had happened. But to me, she was a stranger, a woman capable of such deceit, living under the same roof, sharing the same bed. I wanted to confront her immediately, to throw the evidence in her face, but I knew I had to play it carefully. She was cunning, capable of twisting the narrative in her favor, as she had done before. I needed time to plan my next move, to decide what came next for me, for us, and for our family. Over the next few days, I kept up the act, pretending everything was fine. I laughed at her jokes, nodded at her stories, and even shared meals with her, all while the footage played on a loop in my mind. Each moment felt like a lie, a charade I was forced to participate in. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain: our relationship would never be the same. The trust we had built over years, the foundation of our family, was gone, and in its place was a hollow emptiness, a bitter realization that the woman I loved had betrayed me in the worst way possible. Now, as I sit here writing this, I don't know what my next step will be. Do I confront her again, armed with the evidence she can't deny? Or do I quietly plan my exit, preserving some shred of dignity for myself and my children? All I know is that the life I once cherished, the woman I once trusted, are gone, and I'm left to pick up the pieces, one painful memory at a time. I thought my heart might stop, not from anger, but from relief. I finally had the evidence to confront my unfaithful wife. Just as I was about to close my laptop, I saw her on the footage again at 1:15 a.m., heading toward the guest hallway. Jason, our son's best friend, was staying in the guest room, and she didn't emerge until 2:47 a.m. It was obvious what had happened. The next morning, I didn't wake her. Instead, I contacted my lawyer, who referred me to a divorce attorney. The financial implications were daunting, but I knew I couldn't stay married to someone I no longer trusted. For the sake of my children, I decided not to reveal the details of her betrayal to them, but I was determined to ensure Jason would no longer be part of our lives. That evening, with the kids out of the house, I edited the footage to show only the incriminating moments and called my wife into the room. As the video played, she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. She refused to answer my questions, offering no explanation or defense. When I mentioned showing the video to our children, her demeanor shifted. She dropped to her knees, begging me not to. I laid out my terms. She would accept my alimony conditions and agree to an amicable divorce based on irreconcilable differences. She reluctantly agreed. The next day, we sat our children down to break the news. It was an emotional evening, with our kids pleading for reconciliation. My wife maintained the facade that we were both unhappy and that separation was the best option, though it was clear I was the one driving the decision. In the following days, our family life unraveled. My youngest daughter struggled the most, unable to comprehend why we couldn't work things out. My eldest daughter confronted me, trying to piece together the truth. I gave her vague answers, knowing she might eventually suspect the real reason. Meanwhile, my wife isolated herself, crying alone in her room. When she finally emerged, she looked disheveled, a shell of her former self. At dinner, we sat on opposite ends of the table, a stark contrast to the warm, unified family we once were. A few days later, she asked to meet at a restaurant to talk. Reluctantly, I agreed. She apologized profusely, admitting her selfishness and shame. She claimed the affair began impulsively 6 years ago, during a basketball game. She and Jason had snuck out to her minivan, and what started as a mistake spiraled into a years-long betrayal. Her remorse felt hollow, driven more by being caught than genuine guilt. She begged for a chance to save our marriage, even suggesting an open arrangement where I could see others while she remained faithful. I couldn't stomach the idea. I insisted she tell our children the truth, though she pleaded for more time. Our marriage was beyond repair. The woman I had trusted and loved for years had not only betrayed me, but also shattered the family we had built together. Now, I'm left to pick up the pieces, unsure if the damage can ever truly be undone. She had always wanted to go on a vacation with him, and this seemed like her chance. She confessed that they had been close the day before our trip, something caught on security cameras, and they had been intimate. Even during the vacation, I discovered their affair. When confronted, she explained that while she cared deeply for me, she couldn't resist being physically close to him. She claimed her love for me remained strong, but the relationship with him was purely physical, perhaps hoping this would lessen the betrayal. She admitted that, as she'd grown older, her desire for intimacy had increased significantly. She said my reduced interest left her feeling unsatisfied and frustrated. She claimed that she turned to Jason to cope with this frustration, and that the affair eventually became normalized in her mind. Seeking help, she visited a psychotherapist and was prescribed medication for compulsive sexual behavior, but she stopped due to side effects. She tried using adult toys and therapy to manage her urges, but the affair continued. She revealed all of this to me in an emotional confession. I was overwhelmed, questioning whether I should have noticed or addressed these issues earlier. When I asked why she hadn't told me sooner, she said she had hinted at her feelings, but I dismissed them as a phase. She emphasized that her actions weren't meant to blame me, but stemmed from her heightened sexual desire, which she acknowledged was beyond the norm. She wanted to work on herself, but admitted to being overwhelmed by her unmet needs. After her confession, I was left grappling with mixed emotions. I could see she was struggling with an unhealthy compulsion, but her betrayal still hurt deeply. Despite her explanations, she had broken our marriage vows. I felt I needed time to process everything and sought guidance from my therapist. In therapy, I was advised to set firm boundaries. My therapist recommended that she cut all contact with Jason and that we consider a probation period of 2 to 3 months to evaluate the possibility of reconciliation. He also suggested individual counseling for both of us and possibly couples therapy if I decided to proceed. I took these recommendations seriously and decided to try the probation period for the sake of our children and the life we'd built together. That night, I laid out my conditions. She had to sever all ties with Jason and never see or contact him again. We would also tell our 2 eldest children the truth, ensuring Jason wouldn't have an opportunity to manipulate the narrative. I made it clear that any violation of these terms would lead to the divorce proceeding as planned. She agreed, acknowledging her mistakes and expressing a willingness to do whatever it took to rebuild our marriage. The tension in our household began to ease, though my wife and I still slept in separate rooms. We decided to tell our children the truth after dinner one evening. My wife tearfully admitted her affair to our son and daughter. Their reactions were heartbreaking. My son stormed off in anger, slamming his door, while my daughter whispered, "I knew it," before breaking down. I tried to comfort her as my wife retreated to the guest room, consumed by shame and regret. The following days were tense. My wife remained in her room, avoiding everyone. My son, unable to handle the situation, stayed with a friend. My oldest daughter tried to keep the household together, but worry for her mother grew when she didn't emerge from her room for over 24 hours. We knocked repeatedly, but there was no response. Fearing the worst, I forced the door open with my daughter's help. Inside, we found her unresponsive on the bed, pills and a glass of water on the nightstand. I checked for a pulse, but it was too late. She had been gone for nearly a day. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. My youngest daughter sobbed uncontrollably, while my oldest called emergency services, her voice cracking with panic. The paramedics arrived, confirming what I already knew. As I stood there, watching them prepare to take her body away, I felt an avalanche of guilt and sorrow. Had I been too harsh? Could I have done more to help her? My son arrived soon after and broke down completely, blaming himself for staying away. That night, I spoke to investigators, reliving the events that had led to this moment. My heart was heavy, torn between mourning my wife and wondering how to rebuild what was left of our family. One thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same.